Hope is not a strategy, and retreat is not a tactic. We're not going to do those things. We are going to figure out how this claim specifically needs to get handled. There's way too much noise. We have propped up the carrier as the evil empire, when really and truly the only person that suffers if you win or if they win is the homeowner. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Control the Narrative podcast. I know I'm doing another podcast. Well, there are so many different subjects that I want to talk about while I'm working on a whole bunch of different other projects that are still absolutely in the works. You may have seen the most recent one that came out, which is The Rock and the Ripple, where we talk about different current events that are going on around the country and around the world. And then we're also talking on Undeniable about what it's like to be a small businessman and an entrepreneur, bootstrapping your way through business and bridging that gap between owning your own job and actually having a business that's scalable, and the problems that we run into there. I wanted to drift back into something where I felt like that I had some expertise in, and I had some new things to say. I had gone quiet for a little while. As you know, that I was on the Rumble, and we did a discussion show on the Rumble between me and another guest, and those were all really great episodes. They're all still there for you. I want to make sure that you know that those are all available. But I had gone silent for a little while because honestly, it was based on the carrier's behavior. And as somebody that walks around with a handle called the claims coach, I began to struggle with the thought and the idea of what I was telling you just simply didn't work, because there was no way that I could ever predict what the carrier's behavior was going to be on anything. And so I kind of drew back, right? I do have strategies, I do have tactics, and we will certainly get into those on this show. I wanted to walk back and kind of tell you what I've been up to for the past year. And I've noticed a change in the industry at large that honestly is quite concerning to me. And we have a lot of discussion that's going on around it as I peruse different Facebook forums and look through sort of the state of the industry and the people that I hear, what their experiences are. Even the forums for the independent adjusters, what we're seeing is a lot of resistance to the adjuster profession at large. And you may have seen a podcast that I was just on with Vince Perry, where I talked about that at length. And if you haven't seen it, get over to Vince Perry's channel. We'll put that link down in the comments for you, and you can go check that episode out where I talk about that. And he even exited the claims industry because of just how difficult it was. You had laws that were changing that made things harder for a public adjuster, and then you had just the carrier behavior and overall attitude. And there's been a lot of talk among the public adjuster arena about raising the bar of a public adjuster education and really raising the barrier of entry somewhat. And I agree with all of that. I really do. I agree that public adjusters should be educated. And I agree that there's a lot of public adjusters out there that aren't educated, and they really need to be educated. And because whatever it is, if we follow the claims process perfectly, right, and we turn in the documentation and we do all of those things, it has become commonplace for the carrier just basically, and sometimes I believe, now this is a hot take, I believe that just because I'm a public adjuster, they tell me no. I don't know if you're getting that kind of experience, that it doesn't really matter what you show them. They are going to stick to their guns no matter what. And I had a hard time either charging for seminars or charging for coaching in any kind of way, because I could not tell you that what we were doing was absolutely going to work. I began to struggle even with signing clients because I didn't believe that I was bringing any sort of value to the claim. And the idea is to make the claims process easier, not to protract it, and not to make it harder for the homeowner, and certainly not to lower their chances of getting their claim covered and paid. That is not what we're here to do. What we are here to do is provide expert knowledge on the claims process and the loss that they've suffered, that we put together a package, we deliver it to the carrier, negotiate on their behalf, aid the policyholder in the performing of the duties after a loss, and be that fiduciary in the middle of it all. And it's really interesting when things are going well, that public adjuster is the point through which all communication flows. Whether you're talking about contractors or hygienists or engineers or the homeowner themselves, then you've got the carrier side, the desk adjusters, the managers. Any of those things that are going on are all flowing through that public adjuster, and they become that hub of communication. And if we're going to be the hub of communication, we damn sure need to make sure that we're controlling the narrative and not just being a pass-through of relaying information. What we have to do as public adjusters is maintain control of the narrative, and sometimes that means having to do it without being seen. That's the real struggle, is where do I insert myself? Where do I provide leverage? And you have to evaluate that as a public adjuster, because you don't want to break the one cardinal rule that I've always said. Don't hurt the claim. And if your presence hurts the claim, then that's problematic. I was finding that if the carrier had been out, written an estimate, obviously created a dispute with the homeowner and the contractor, that's when public adjusters get called in. And I found it quite fruitless, at least in the state of Texas, to even try to supplement the claim, because basically it just turned into an appraisal demand, and we moved into appraisal, and appraisal became sudden death overtime for the claim. And the appraisal process is how it's played out, at least in my viewpoint, is nothing other than what the claims process should be. It's like the claims process became this pro forma or customary steps that we went through just to get it into appraisal, where the real decisions are made. And I believe that that is obviously hurting the policyholder. It's to an additional expense to the policyholder. It's an exposure that allows not just the time to increase, but as time increases, expenses increase. Obviously, the emotional wear and tear that the policyholder endures. And that's not a good thing, right? That's not what we're there to do. We're not there to make it harder. And I don't want to sound like a broken record. We're there to grease gates. We're there to abbreviate the claims process. We are there to bring a level of efficiency that otherwise would not be there. The supplement process has almost died, where you can't go, look, my contractor and my carrier disagree, and let's send in a supplement and we get this covered or that covered, and there's an agreement, and we talk about O&P or whatever the different things that we might talk about are. It just became that our estimate is the end all be all, and we're not going any further than that, and good luck to you. And they would just stick to their guns. And so I have been kind of hiding out for the last year and a half or so, and have been very quiet other than the occasional reel that I may put out. But I've been refining. I didn't really disappear. I tried to let you know that I was out there a little bit here and there, but I've been refining my message, and it has basically come into one central thought is I'm never going to be able to control what the carrier does, and neither can you. And so we're going to talk about strategy. We're going to talk about tips. We're going to talk about tactics, okay? And I want you to know that hope is not a strategy, so we can't use that below the line thinking where we're going to play the reactive defensive game. Hope is not a strategy, and retreat is not a tactic. We're not gonna do those things. We are going to figure out how this claim specifically needs to get handled. Obviously, that's going to include who's the carrier, right? That's usually one of my very first questions is who is the carrier on this claim, because I already know how they behave. You know how they behave. And that is important, critical, need to know information that if you're not using in your evaluation of what's going on, then you're missing part of it. And that's the thing, is it almost feels like we have to be completely perfect in order to get a claim paid. And there's a call for more education. Well, I am all for more education. I am all for standardizing the process. But here's the issue. If the carrier doesn't respect what it is, and there's no real leverage or real consequence that we can levy against the carrier for the permission of what appears to be a permission structure of bad faith, because there's no consequences until we go to court. And even once we litigate, things get closed and sealed and non-disclosures get signed and nobody ever really talks about it. There's never any admission of liability. They simply just pay it to make it go away. Not because they believe you're right, but because they just want it to go away. Because if it goes to court and they lose and it becomes case law, that becomes a much more difficult thing to overcome down the road. So this is all about them controlling the narrative. And one of the key points and the key ideas that they are trying to make happen is set no precedent. They want to make sure that there is no standardized effort in how claims get handled. You'll often hear them say, this claim is taken on its merit. And I believe that claims should be handled on their individual merit, whether or not they need to be covered. I think you have to evaluate each one individually. There is no cookie cutter method to determine what coverage is, right? But I believe that where there may not be those cookie cutter methods that are out there to determine what the coverage is or how the claim should go, I do believe that procedure matters. I believe that what we do and how we do it and how we present it and how we communicate it, that matters. And that's what I want to drill down on. And that's what I want to talk about on this show. Occasionally I'll have a guest and we'll talk about it. I've got a lot of really good friends that are attorneys that we've discussed different things left, right, and center of all the things that are going on in the claims industry, from what's going on with the new appraisal laws in Texas to the new public adjuster restrictions that we're seeing happening in Kentucky. There is a lot of political unbalance that exists between the two sides. And I believe that the more that we assert the right way to do it, the more likely that that is going to be seen as the actual way to do things. Carriers have constantly changed what they want to approve and how they believe that it's relevant to whatever claim and whatever their guidelines are. And most of you realize that most of the independent adjusters and even the staff adjusters I talk to, which are great people, they're not any different than a public adjuster or a contractor. They've got kids and they've got soccer practice at 6 o'clock too. There's no way that they're getting out of that. They're just people trying to do a job based on the way that they've been taught to do it. And no matter what you may think of them, they are not inclined to step away from their resource. Right now, that carrier's method is more than just a way of thinking about things. It represents a resource to them and their family, and they're going to want to protect and defend that at all cost. So the way that we handle this has to become more collaborative and less combative. And I don't want to sit up on a soapbox and tell you all of my different opinions and why I think I'm right and why I think maybe Steve Badger is trying to extend an olive branch but could possibly be messing everything up all at the same time. I don't really have an opinion on that. What I do have an opinion on is that public adjusters are not going to pay for training that's not respected at the carrier level. And until that happens, that training is going to become something that gets perverted. A little bit of it works. And really, when you create something where you're not following the laws as they've been adopted by the state and how they're presented to the insurance code of the individual state. I realize that we have federal acts and then we have the state interpretation of that federal act, and that really kind of determines the insurance code as far as we're concerned. And how those things get interpreted and presented, all of those have to matter at some level, and they have to be held accountable. And until that happens, there's no reason for them to listen to anything that we have to say. But what I'm going to tell you is understand the law, know the insurance code, read everything that you can as it pertains to statute, and especially read everything you can as it pertains to procedure and what they expect out of a public adjuster or any other claims professional in the region. I personally just feel like that there's way too much noise that's bouncing around out there. I feel like that there is an echo chamber that has existed, and we have propped up the carrier as the evil empire, when really and truly the only person that suffers if you win or if they win is the homeowner. How many of us have held on to claims that way too long? Just because our ego got involved and we wanted to be right and we knew we were right and we felt like that we had the support of God Almighty Himself with Moses standing on the mountain and two stone tablets saying we were right. But that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if we're right. What matters is that we present something on behalf of the homeowner that's simply defensible, and that's really the end of our job. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. It's not as complicated. So all of these different tactics of you may hear something about the carrier not accepting a proof of loss, and then there's all of this discussion about, oh well, tell them that you appreciate. Even though they rejected it, thank you for confirming that you've received my proof of loss. All of these things, it doesn't matter whether they reject it or not. You sent it, that's the end of it. It requires no further discussion. And if the state that you're in is a proof of loss state, then that thing is going to stand, and you don't need them to agree with it. And stop making combative posture over things that don't really or materially really matter. Now, I will tell you, I have moved into any discussion that I have with the carrier. If it is not via email and in writing as a part of the record, I send a follow-up email very quickly thereafter, because I want any conversation that I have with them to be a part of the record, and I want to give them an opportunity to correct the record. But I have descended into that portion where I just don't have anything to say to them. I am going to put it in my report and I'm going to present that to them. And I think that that's the idea. The core philosophy here is that you can't control the carrier. Only you can control your own process. And that's one of the very first things I even want to talk about in this episode today is how do we develop a process. So I'm gonna share with you sort of my take on it and how I go about it and how I break things down. And it can be titled a bunch of different things. It's how you build a great file. I just simply, this is how I control the narrative. I don't care where the claim is at. It doesn't change what needs to be done when I first show up on the scene. And the first thing that I have to do is conduct an investigation. And that investigation is going to turn up two different kinds of evidence. The first kind of evidence that it's going to turn up is direct evidence. This is hard proof. These are direct evidence is that they say that we have 2.25-inch hail hit the house, and then they happen to save one in their freezer. And they hold it out and they take a picture of it, or they even still have it. This is the hail that fell at my house. That's direct evidence. That's real hard evidence, which is great. The other kind of evidence, and this is mostly what all of us operate on, is circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is what shapes almost all of the claims industry. And mainly it's because we never are working from a point in time other than the date of loss. One of the things that we're missing, one of the biggest things that is missing in most every single insurance claim is a historical record. We just don't have that. Many times we've called up to the carrier and go, can I see the underwriting photos? Prove to me that that's old damage. And they'll never do it because it's not their job to provide us evidence against their narrative. Now, I do believe that it is property of the homeowner and they should release it. But how I feel about it doesn't change the fight that it takes to actually get it. So we've got to come up with a different way of doing things. At the end of the day, when we're dealing with circumstantial evidence, I believe that it is going to fall in one of three categories. Okay. The first category is firsthand evidence. This is the evidence that you actually collect, that you go out and these are pictures that you take. These are interviews that you have taken. This is estimates that possibly that you have written, scopes that you've written down, sketches that you may have made. And obviously it's your account or retelling of the events. That is your firsthand evidence as to what happened. And you're going to piece that together in a narrative. That all of that matters, what your take is. Collected evidence that you're going to bring in is obviously your interpretation of the policy and coverage that's at hand given this particular loss. Now, firsthand evidence, you can't sleep on this. And one of the things that public adjusters often struggle with especially the solo guys, is the collection of this on top of having to run a business, on top of having to communicate with the carrier and make sure files are followed up on, and all of the different things that you have to do to see a claim from cradle to grave, A to Z, soup to nuts. None of that's easy, right? You're having to do all of that. And you're going to have to figure out the thing that you're really good at. What is your core competency? If it's estimating, then you want to spend your time estimating. If your core competency is inspecting the loss and figuring out what causation was and the origin and where things began and the efficient proximate cause and really kind of putting that puzzle piece together, then that's where you're going to want to spend your time, is on inspections and in that kind of invasive investigation that's required often to get to the truth. Your core competency may be on negotiating with the carrier. And so you want to make sure your time is there, because this is the element, this is the A game that you bring. Now, there's a lot of us out there that have become kind of hybrid warriors on all of this. The issue is the time factor that comes into play. I'm not saying you have to pay somebody. I'm not saying you have to outsource it. I'm saying that you should consider it, because as claim loads increase, especially during a time where there's a lot of events that are happening back to back, or you might have a widespread event. I recall back in 2021 here in the North Texas region, we had a freeze. And in fact, it was called Winter Storm Uri, is what I believe that they named the storm as. And the power grid failed in Texas, and we were going through rolling blackouts. I've lived in Texas all 53 years of my life, and I have never seen rolling blackouts occur, not in the hottest of hot summers and not in the winters, because we don't have a lot of really, really cold winters. But this one, these few days it was cold. We suffered rolling blackouts, pipes froze. It was a widespread event. We ran short on equipment, and it was unprecedented at that point in time. We often get sucked into these situations and that claim load comes in a real fast kind of way, because we're working off of catastrophic situations. We're working off of catastrophic events, especially in the beginning of our career, prior to us picking up the network required, where you get those, what I would call daily claims. You have to kind of pick what that documentation is that you're really good at. What part of the claim is it that you're really good at? And then you hire someone better than you if you want to, or you figure out what your process is to get this firsthand documentation, because it's some of the most important, and it is how you are going to begin to shape your narrative. The second type of documentation that I think really, really matters is the expert documentation. Now, every single claim should have expert documentation, and what is classified as expert documentation? That's the contractor you're working with. I know a lot of public adjusters like to write estimates. And I'll tell you all the time that if you look in the policy, there is no place where it says that a carrier should write an estimate. Now, we've all acquiesced to the thought and the idea that they deserve to conduct an investigation, and part of that investigation might include an inspection. And obviously, it is going to include their take on how much it should cost, which generates an estimate. I don't have a problem with them writing an estimate, but their investigation often is not centered around what we're actually claiming. It's centered around what they would like for us to claim. And that's where two different stories get told. And what we are essentially what we are selling as a service is to make sure that the right story gets told. And this expert documentation, and this is why I use contractors all of the time. And here's the reason I use contractors as much. And one of my core competencies is estimating, but I hardly estimate anymore at all. Because the truth is that while I am good at it, and while I know how to write an Xactimate or even Symbility, the reality is that this industry exists above my knowledge of it, Xactimate's knowledge of it. There is a market that exists, and this contractor happens to be not just in the market, he happens to be the chosen individual that's swinging the hammer. So I am not going to put myself in a position to tell that guy how he should go about getting the work done, because his expertise exceeds my expertise. And so any place that you are using documentation that exceeds your personal expertise. It moves from firsthand documentation because your documentation doesn't matter there anymore because it has now been trumped essentially by an expert that you brought in. This can be an engineer. This can be an environmental hygienist. This can be just your general contractor that comes in that does a lot of work and understands what's going on there. I love to use it because I love to use my contractor as my first line of defense and expert documentation because they're actually in the market. They're the ones that are getting the work done, and it quits being an estimate and becomes a bid. And there's a difference between an estimate and a bid. Adjusters write estimates. This is what we think it could cost. It's a good run and start at it. And many of us can be incredibly accurate. And I know a lot of those public adjusters out there are great estimators, right? But I have also realized that if you took a room full of 100 adjusters and you had them go out and scope the loss, and then you took Xactimate away from them, could they actually write the takeoff and the estimate or the bid that is required without the help of Xactimate? So no, we're not really estimators. We're software operators in a lot of ways, right? I don't want to take away your understanding of the steps and the components that go into it. I am certainly not doing that. What I am saying is that you take that tool away and it becomes a much different playing field. And that's what I would say also about the carrier. If the adjuster that you're working with, if you took Xactimate away from him, does he have any idea what's going on? And most of the time it's no. And if they have any idea what's going on, then they're probably going to be very close to what your contractor is suggesting. And that's sort of my barometer because they're looking at two different approaches. And right now, I am not worried about defending against their approach. I am more concerned about establishing what our approach is and what's actually going to get done in material of what the carrier approves or disapproves. Because the carrier is making sense of a number. They're using a bunch of line items to get to a number that they feel comfortable with paying. And that's essentially what we're doing. And then once all of that is settled and we get to the number that everybody is going to settle on and go with, then a whole bunch of different set of things begin to happen. Does the roof get changed? Sure, it gets changed. But the way and the method and the means and the costs and all of that stuff pretty much becomes a much different conversation in the real world. We are using these different tools to establish some understanding, but the estimate from the carrier or from the public adjuster is sort of a take ahead of anything being done. But when we have a contractor involved, we get to alleviate ourselves from that estimating practice, and it comes from the contractor. Now, I'm not defending what I'm thinking. I am supporting what a market professional says needs to be done. And I am there to make sure that we stay within two specific guardrails. Guardrail number one, like, kind, and quality. And guardrail number two, a fair market price. Like, kind, and quality that is done at a fair market price. And that becomes the two guardrails that we're working in. So if you've got an 18 square roof and a roofer charging $100,000, that's problematic. We're not in a fair market price at that point in time anymore. That steps outside of that one guardrail. But if we're within the market and we're using like, kind, and quality materials, then that becomes a number that's not just defensible. It's exactly what the policy calls for. It's like, kind, and quality done at a fair market price using common construction or similar construction. So we're not using any special methods. We're not making up new methods. These are all tried and true efforts that exist. And that's what I begin to defend. So when I get that expert documentation, I then seek to go to the third kind of evidence. I look at things such as building code to support that. And that third kind of evidence is called third-party unbiased documentation or third-party evidence. This is evidence that often exists prior or ahead of the loss. So building code existed long before anybody's loss occurred, right? We had the building code. Most of us are working off a date like 2021 building code or 2018 building code. Some of us 2015 building code. All of those building codes pre-existed any sort of loss that we're experiencing in 2026, and we use that. You're going to see things like the IICRC standard. That is the standard by which water mitigation is completed. right? That is also the standard by which fire losses are handled and how we determine what is right and what is wrong. You've got OSHA standards out there. All of these things exist, right? And it's not because it's a matter of code that you're saying it. It's like you've got to pay this because it's code. No, you've got to pay for this because it's common construction, because it's similar construction. It is the way and the method that this gets done. Let me give you an example. For example, we've seen a lot of carriers come back and recommend these individual shingle repairs. And in another show, I'll go into why this is wrong. But individual shingle repairs for a widespread hail or wind event is not a method that has ever been used. That's not common construction. That's not similar construction. Common construction and similar construction at a bare minimum requires a lot of overlap into what is often undamaged areas in order to provide access and egress to address the damage and fully indemnify that loss, right? And so that goes back into your third-party unbiased documentation that pre-existed the loss, the policy. You start arguing it from that kind of thing. And I tell people all the time, when you're writing your narrative or you're coming at it from a position, don't come at it from an argumentative standpoint. Stop arguing whether or not this is wear and tear or whether this is hail damage, and start arguing the coverage. Because even when we get into areas that are undamaged, many policies have what's called an ensuing loss provision. They understand that you got to make a bigger mess to clean up the little mess that was made by the covered peril. So it's not just direct physical damage. Yes, direct physical damage is the catalyst that springs loose all of the coverage that's available. And I've said this a lot too. Many people have listened to me, whether I'm speaking at an event or even one of my own seminars, is that an insurance policy, even though it is third-party unbiased documentation, it is right down the line, and that's what we're using. It's not there to benefit the carrier. It's not there to benefit the homeowner. It is there to maintain the line. That policy exists if there's a disagreement. And so they know that. And so a policy is essentially one sentence of a promise and then 82 pages of why they're not going to keep it. And we use that. We leverage that. They had 82 pages to tell me that O&P wasn't covered, but they didn't. That's another thing we'll get into, is sort of my philosophy on O&P for everybody, but that's a different episode. This third-party unbiased documentation becomes crucial. It is what sets forth the standard, the common construction, the similar construction. This is how it's done. No roofer goes up and repairs individual remarks and then warranties it. That's the important thing. It's not whether or not it can be repaired or it's reasonable that it can be repaired. Is the roofer going to assume the liability for the work that he's done, or is he going to hang it around the neck of the homeowner? Because he is essentially conducting a repair at the behest of the carrier that is outside of what his professional recommendation would be. That's a problem. And that's why we have gotten so adversarial, because we just simply disagree and we're not documenting it. We're assuming that it's obvious, and you cannot assume that any damage is obvious. And if your defense is, well, just look at it, well, that's going to be a problem too. You've got to connect the dots. You have to tell the entire story, because if you're missing this third-party documentation, and here's the beautiful thing, is that you have said it in your narrative. And now it's not just you that's saying it. It's not just a contractor that's saying it. There's these entire other organizations and entities that exist that are saying the exact same thing you're saying, the exact same thing the contractor's saying. And right now, what we've got is three separate, unrelated, disinterested parties saying the same thing, and you, the carrier, are only saying this. Now, I wish that worked and they would see the light of day, but obviously what's been happening is that they won't listen to those arguments, and it's being pushed into appraisal. So what's the point? The point is if you have this written report and you're ready to go and you've built the claim this way, when it goes to appraisal, your appraiser has very little to do. That cuts down on the cost of the appraisal. Now, I realize that all of us have a minimum that we charge if we're handling appraisals. I understand all that. That's why I personally, between you and me, while the appraisal process is kind of what we've all pivoted to in order to make any sort of predictable revenue out of a public adjusting business, since we've all pivoted to that, it has become comfortable for us to resist the fact that they are not properly executing the contract as it pertains to the policy. And here's the other little thing. Well, at least in the state of Texas, did you know that for a claim to be valid, it has to be submitted in writing? So if you're just turning in an estimate, that's not a claim, that's an estimate. And I don't want to allow the carrier to come out and tell me what he thinks we should claim. That makes about as much sense as me punching you in the nose and trying to convince you of how bad it hurts. That just doesn't make any sense. And so when I create this report, obviously it is great if I can get there before the carrier does. But before I engage the carrier in any kind of way, one of the things I do is I make sure this report is written. And it's like, I am resetting the claim. Now, you can come out and reinspect it, but I'm not really requiring that you do it because you're just going to send somebody else to do exactly the same thing that I did, or you're going to confirm or stick with your denial, stick with your guy, stick with your plan, stick with your narrative. Problem is that there is nothing in the claims process that allows them to establish a narrative. And that's the posture you come from. That's not a matter of opinion. That's a matter of fact when it says that the homeowner has to prove the loss. And so that's my question. Who proves the loss? If it's the homeowner, then the carrier is to remain silent until we've proven our loss. And if you haven't done that, don't be surprised when they write a claim below deductible. This idea of how you put all of this together in a report is really quite simple, right? So you have a narrative. This is going to catalog all of your firsthand documentation. I write a technical report that gives an explanation of all of the third-party documentation that I have to go along with it, and any additional and any expert documentation I have. So it's an industrial hygienist or a contractor's estimate. And then I also bring in the information, whether it's code related, standards related, OSHA, whatever the case may be. I keep all of that ready to go just so that they know this is the place that we're coming from, and I dare you to argue with it. And that's fine with me if they want to argue with it, but I don't have any sort of emotional investment of whether they say yes or no. Right? Because I'm not really here to negotiate your narrative. If you would like to negotiate my narrative, then that's fine. But if you don't want to negotiate my narrative, then we do have to look at alternate dispute resolutions. And I certainly hope that that changes very, very soon. I hope that we can return to a time where we're collaborative. But when carriers are offering up the unfounded denials or just using an opinion as material fact when it's in fact not, that becomes very difficult. And essentially, they're gaslighting you. They're telling you that it's wear and tear when you know good and well that it's not, and you've proved 19 different ways that it's not. Right? So stop laboring with that. If they don't want to hear the truth and adhere to the truth, then you've got to move it down the line. But the beautiful thing is if you create this work product with all of this kinds of documentation and explanation and you lay it out there for them, it becomes a much easier process to defend. And it becomes something that an appraiser can easily help you with. And if it needs to go that far, an attorney. And I'm telling you, don't just pull the ripcord on appraisal because you're trying to get to a payday. Look at what they're doing. Look at what they're doing, and don't remove the homeowner or the policyholder's opportunity to pursue other remedies outside of just getting some agreed amount on the claim. There's more at work here. I'm going to tell you this, and there's no other way for me to put it. Own your own story, or somebody else will.